Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
Ek sol Baldri, blóðgum tífur, Óðinsbarni örlog folgin, stod og vaxin volum herri, merok mjokfagar misteltein. Varð af meiði, þeims mer syndisk, harmflog hatlig, holvernam skjóta, Baldrs bróður vas of borin snimma, sonam Óðinssonar einnættarvega. In the poem Völuspá, Odin receives a terrifying message about the fate of his son Baldr from a dead seeress, as I have just recited here. Quote, I saw for Baldr, for the bloody god, Odin's child his fate in store. There stood grown, higher than the plain, slender and very fair, the mistletoe. From that stem which seemed so slender, there came a dangerous grief dart. Hod started to shoot. Baldr's brother was born quickly. Odin's son started killing at 1 night old. End quote. Today's story is about the death of the god Baldr, one of Odin's many sons. And really, it's a story about 3 of Odin's sons, Baldr, Holdr, and Hermodr. But Baldr is the most beloved of them all, so let's start there. In Gylfaginning 22 of the Prose Edda, Snorri gives us a pleasantly detailed introduction to Baldr. He tells us, quote, Odin's second son is Baldr, and there is good to be told of him. He is best, and all praise him. He is so fair in appearance and so bright that light shines from him. And there is a plant so white that it is called after Baldr's eyelash. It is the whitest of all plants, and from this you can tell his beauty, both of hair and body. He is the wisest of the Aesir, and most beautifully spoken, and most merciful. But it is one of his characteristics that none of his decisions can be fulfilled. He lives in a place called Breidablik. This is in heaven. No unclean thing is permitted to be there. End quote. So, when we imagine Baldr, we should imagine him as literally the best, in every possible way. Admittedly, Snorri does seem to be getting a little carried away with some of the Christian-sounding language here, placing Baldr's estate in heaven and asserting that no unclean thing is permitted to enter. But what's a little more interesting is this claim that none of Baldr's decisions can be fulfilled. The Old Norse phrase there is engi må haldast dómur hans, which can be more literally translated as his judgments can't be held. I've tried to research a clear explanation of what exactly this means, but haven't been able to find a great explanation so far. In my mind, this could mean anything from a notion that Baldr is indecisive, to the idea that his decrees don't last very long, or even that he can't pass any divine judgments at all because he's currently dead. So I'm going to leave it up to you to interpret what you think it means. Gylfaginning 32 tells us that Baldr is the father of another god named Forseti, and that his wife's name is Nanna. His hall is named Glitnir, and, quote, whoever comes to him with difficult legal disputes, they all leave with their differences settled. It is the best place of judgment among gods and men, end quote. Which is a really weird thing to try and reconcile with the idea that his judgments can't be held. Gylfaginning 56 provides a story confirming Baldr's unusual attractiveness when Skadi is offered her choice of husband among the gods as recompense for her father's death. But she is forced to make the choice seeing only everyone's feet. She attempts to choose the most attractive feet, stating that there can be little that is ugly about Baldr, but as it turns out, Njordr's feet must be in the same league of attractiveness as Baldr's because that's who she accidentally chooses. Rudolf Simek notes that various sources seem to portray Baldr as the mythic ancestor of the Danish royal family in Lyra. There's even a location nearby that was apparently anciently called Breidablik, or a more Danish version of the word Breidablik. I'm notoriously terrible at pronouncing Danish words, and no matter how much I practiced trying to say it the way Google Translate was telling me to, the best I could manage was something like Breidablik, so forgive me for not even really trying. Anyway, Simek also notes that the story of Baldr's death appears to be at least as old as the later migration period, with famous scenes from the story having been depicted on bracteates dating to 600 years before the Prose Edda. But without any more stalling, why don't we get right into that story? Baldr's death is a big deal.
It's prophesied in 2 surviving poems in the Poetic Edda and referenced in others, and it's explained in an unusual amount of detail by Snorri in the Prose Edda. As we begin the story today, we begin with the poem Baldr's Draumar, which is devoted entirely to a prophecy about Baldr's death. Picking up from the beginning of that poem, all the gods and goddesses, the Aesir and the Olsenur, are meeting in council to debate an unusual topic. As it turns out, Baldr has been having what the text calls balir draumar, baleful dreams, and these dreams are apparently bad enough to warrant a full council of deities to determine the cause. But presumably the council can't solve the problem on its own, so Odin decides to take matters into his own hands. He saddles up his trusty steed Sleipnir and takes a ride into Niflheimr towards Hel, where he knows he can find the grave of a dead seeress. Along the way, he passes an unnamed dog with blood on its chest that barks at him, which is maybe supposed to be the famous dog Garmr that we are told in Völuspá lies bound in front of Hel's gates. But Odin rides on past until he comes to the High Hall of Hel. And he doesn't stop there. He isn't interested in speaking with Hel. For whatever reason, the knowledge he wants seems to be buried alongside this one unnamed seeress. Arriving at the grave, Odin speaks a resurrection spell, temporarily reviving her, and she rises, though reluctantly, and begins speaking, quote, corpse words. She questions who this person is who has revived her after such a long time of being dead in her grave, rained and snowed upon, and collecting dew. And Odin replies with a disguised name, calling himself Vegtamr, which translates to way tame, and is probably supposed to mean something like a wanderer, in a sense of sort of being tamed by the ways and roads. Odin then asks for news from Hel. He mentions that on the journey in, he's noticed some fancy decorations, as though the place is preparing for the arrival of a high-profile visitor. The seeress, who would very much rather get back to her business being dead, is blunt. "Here mead stands brewed for Baldr," she says. "I've told you this reluctantly, and now I'm done talking." But Odin demands that she continue to answer his questions. After each question and answer, she finishes her statement with, "Now I'll be silent," and Odin replies with, "Don't be silent, seeress, I want to question you." Throughout their conversation, it's revealed exactly who will kill Baldr, and how vengeance will be taken upon the killer, which we'll get to later. But finally, Odin asks a mysterious question that somehow gives away his true identity. He wants to know, quote, "Who are those girls who weep for their pleasure?" End quote. Larrington notes that we can only guess at who these girls might be, since the seeress doesn't answer the question. Maybe these girls are Norns. Maybe there's a disguised kenning here and we don't fully understand. But suddenly the seeress realizes who she's talking to. "You're not Vegtamr as I thought," she exclaims. "You're Odin." "Yeah, and you're not a seeress or a wise woman, you're the mother of 3 ogres, Odin replies, and the seeress ends up telling him to basically just get out of here, and expresses a desire not to have any more visitors until the end of the world. Presumably, without any more demands from Odin, she is finally able to be silent and get back to death. As I mentioned, the seeress here is unnamed, as is the seeress who speaks in Völuspá. And this story is essentially the reason why we believe that in Völuspá, Odin has resurrected a dead seeress to tell him about the future. Baldr's Draumar teaches us that this is something Odin does. And at the end of Völuspá, the seeress expresses that having finished delivering her message, she will now sink. And we assume this probably means she will sink back into her grave. The general idea is that Völuspá and Baldr's Draumar are probably giving us a repeated theme, if not 2 different versions of the exact same event. In fact, Völuspá stanzas 32 through 35 have the seeress giving Odin all the same details given to him by the seeress here in Baldr's Draumar. That Baldr will die, how he will die, who will kill him, how vengeance will be attained, and what the ultimate consequences will be. So it actually starts to get pretty hard to assume Völuspá and Baldr's Draumar aren't related in some way. But Baldr's Draumar is only about the prophecy, and about the fact that Odin learns about events to come. From here, we need to shift gears over into the Prose Edda, specifically to Gylfaginning section 49, for details about how that prophecy plays out. Gylfaginning, of course, is framed as a conversation between a disguised king/traveler named Gylfi and 3 enthroned wizards in a town named after Osgarðr. Section 49 begins with a question from the king about the most significant events that have taken place among the Aesir. And this question is answered with the following story. Similar to what we are told in Baldr's Draumar, Baldr has been having foreboding dreams about peril to his own life. He reports this problem to the other gods, and they decide to hold council about what to do. Snorri doesn't relate anything about Odin's journey to Hel to meet with the dead seeress here, but what he does tell us is that the gods ultimately decide together that immunity should be requested on Baldr's behalf from all kinds of potential danger. This process seems to be led by Frigg, and however exactly it went down, Frigg ends up receiving solemn promises from fire, water, iron, all kinds of metal, stones, the earth, trees, diseases, animals, birds, poison, and snakes that they will all not harm her son Baldr. As a result, Baldr seems to become invincible. Because there is apparently no living thing or inanimate object that will hurt Baldr, it becomes sort of a sport among the Aesir that whenever they have assemblies, Baldr would stand up and let everybody shoot or throw things at him or try to hit him with stuff, and everybody would revel in the fact that nothing would ever hurt him. They all thought Baldr's invincibility was what the source calls mikil frami, great glory. That is, everybody except for Loki. Snorri explains that, quote, when Loki Laufeyarson saw this, he was not pleased that Baldr was unharmed, end quote. And it's at this moment Loki decides that Baldr needs to die. This is the sum total of information we are ever given about Loki's decision to engineer Baldr's death. He sees everyone ascribing Baldr some great glory and becomes displeased that Baldr is not being harmed. With that limited information, it looks a lot like a bad case of jealousy or envy. But to be fair, people have gone looking for deeper motivations, theorizing that maybe Loki wanted to get even with Odin for what was done to his own children, Hel, Jormungandr, and Fenrir. But to be clear about our actual source material, we are given no other information about his decision than that he saw Baldr being attributed some great glory and then became upset that he was not being harmed. In fact, this same type of behavior comes up one other time at a feast the gods are having in the poem Lokasenna, which we'll talk about in more depth next time. Here's the relevant piece from Lokasenna's prose introduction. Quote, Aegir had two servants, Fimafang and Eldir. Shining gold was used instead of firelight. Ale went around by itself. That was a great place of peace. People praised the excellence of Aegir's servers. Loki could not bear to hear that, and he killed Fimafang. Then the Aesir shook their shields and shrieked at Loki and chased him out to the woods. End quote. So here we have another example where someone is getting a bunch of positive attention for some ability he possesses, and this displeases Loki, and he kills that character. It's much harder to try and come up with deeper motivations for this one, because Aegir is apparently a Jotun, who likely had nothing at all to do with the binding of Fenrir, much less his servants, who are, by all accounts, completely innocent of any wrongdoing at all that we know of. So, however you'd like to try and explain Loki's behavior is up to you. But what we can say definitively is that there are two separate instances where Loki engineers an innocent character's death without an explanation of any kind of motivation beyond the fact that he was displeased by seeing them receive positive attention for their abilities. In the case of Baldr, the killing is not so easy, because, as we've already been told, Baldr seems to be invincible. So Loki transforms himself into a woman's likeness, a topic we covered in a lot more depth back in episode 16, and he travels to a place called Fensalir to visit Frigg. Frigg asks her visitor for news from the assembly, and female-disguised Loki replies that everyone is shooting at Baldr and nothing seems to be hurting him. Frigg isn't surprised by this. Weapons and wood will not hurt Baldr, she says. I have received oaths from them all. So, have you gotten sworn oaths from literally everything? Loki responds. I imagine he's saying this as innocently as he possibly can. Well, Frigg replies, there is this one sprig of a tree called mistletoe growing to the west of Valhall. At the time, it seemed to me like it was too young to demand an oath from. At this point, Loki immediately vanishes out of sight, and I can only imagine Frigg must have realized the huge mistake she just made in that moment. But Loki finds the mistletoe, plucks it up, and travels back to the assembly. When he arrives, Baldr is surrounded by a circular crowd of people, and his brother Hrólfr, who we learn here is blind, is sort of getting sidelined and standing on the outside edge of the circle. Loki approaches Hrólfr and asks why he's not shooting at Baldr like everyone else. 2 reasons, Hodor replies. I'm blind, and I don't have a weapon. No worries, Loki says. You should do honor towards Baldr like everyone else. I'll point you in the right direction, and you can shoot him with this wand. Let's pause for just a second here and talk about what this weapon is. Mistletoe is not a tree, as Snorri called it just a moment ago. It's not sturdy wood, it's a vine. So there seems to be a little bit of confusion in this account coming from Iceland, which had been essentially completely deforested by the time this story was written down, about the nature of this mistletoe plant. With that in mind, we might assume Icelanders telling this story centuries ago may not have seen any problem with assuming any weapon you might make out of wood could have been made by Loki out of this mistletoe. In this case, wand is the most specific word we get, which in this context basically just means a stick. The fact that the story keeps using the word shoot might lead us to believe that the mistletoe has been made into an arrow, but it's really kind of hard to say. This is why different translators will sometimes say things like arrow or spear, but in the end, the most specific word we actually get is wand. So Hodor takes the mistletoe and shoots it at Baldr. The shot slams all the way through him, and he immediately falls down dead. This comes to be known as the unluckiest deed ever done among gods and men. But in this moment, as it happens, all the gods just sort of gawk in speechless horror, and everybody's heads turn towards Hodor, who I can only imagine must have been like, "What? What happened?" And when the shock begins to fade, the only thing that can come out of anyone's mouth is weeping, and nobody can formulate any coherent sentences about what's just happened. But Odin takes this harder than anyone, not only because Baldr is his son, but also, as Snorri reminds us, because he knew what great deprivation and loss the death of Baldr would cause the Aesir. This is a prophesied step towards Ragnarok, and although we don't get much information in the sources about Baldr's role as, say, a warrior, there is at least one small clue hinting towards Baldr's fighting nature, which I'll come back to, and we can probably take this to mean that another pivotal personality has just been removed from the game in some way, adding to the circumstances that will eventually cause the gods to lose that epic battle. In modern times, we would blame Baldr's death entirely on Loki and view Hodor as an innocent victim in the situation. But that's not exactly how things work in the Norse mindset. Loki is certainly at fault, but because Hodor is the one who fired the shot that killed Baldr, he's going to have to suffer consequences as well. Normally, vengeance would have been swift, but the assembly is a place of sanctuary where no blood can be spilled, which also makes Baldr's murder all the worse. As the gods begin coming back into some kind of presence of mind, which apparently took a long time, or at least long enough for Frigg to arrive at the assembly, Frigg speaks up and offers all of her love and favor to anyone who will ride the road to Hel to find Baldr and offer to pay Hel in return for allowing him to return. Another of Odin's sons, Hermodr, takes up the charge. He immediately mounts up on Sleipnir and gallops away. Here in Osgardr, the Aesir begin preparing for Baldr's funeral. The plan is to carry his body to the sea, put it on a boat, and launch it out into the water. But the ship they use is the biggest of all ships, which probably seemed like a good idea on paper, but in practice, it's so heavy that no one can get it to budge. So the gods send for a Jotun woman named Hyrrokin, and she shows up riding on a wolf with snakes for reins. When she dismounts, Odin calls on 4 of his special warriors called berserkers, and who we'll talk more about another time, to try and tend to the wolf. But it turns out that they can't keep it under control without basically beating it up. Hyrrokin walks down to the boat, and with her first touch, she is able to push it so hard that the roller logs underneath it catch on fire, and there's a huge earthquake as it speeds down into the water. Thor reacts to this sudden tumult almost like a well-trained soldier, and in a flash, he's got a hold of his hammer and is about to smash Hyrrokin's head in. But all the gods are like, wait, stop! And they ask him to spare her. Typically, we assume that Thor does indeed refrain from killing Hyrrokin here, specifically because Snorri doesn't tell us that Thor goes through with the attack. But it's worth noting that another part of the Prose Edda, called Skaldskaparmal, preserves a fragment of a poem by a poet named Thorbjorn Dísarskald, which contains a list of Jotun women Thor has killed, and that list includes the name Hyrrokin. What it doesn't tell us is when or where any of these women were killed, so it's possible Thor kills her in some other story that no longer survives, or it's possible that in another lost version of this same story, she doesn't make it out of the funeral alive. Either way, at this point, Baldr's body is not yet on the boat, so as his body is now carried down to the water, his wife Nanna collapses with grief and dies, so both she and her husband end up being laid on the pyre that's been built onto the ship and then set on fire. Now, the question about this is, did Nanna really die of grief? Or is Snorri sanitizing an old reference to something like suttee that 13th century Christian culture finds unpalatable? Hilda Ellis Davidson points out that the archaeological record provides evidence that wives were sometimes killed alongside their husbands in Scandinavia as early as the Bronze Age and as late as the historical written record. For example, Olaf's saga Tryggvasonar contains the following line, quote, "Now at that time, Sigríður the Proud had left King Eric, and people said he felt disgraced by her behavior, for it was in fact the law in Sweden that if a king died, the queen should be laid in the howe beside him." End quote. Instances of wives either killing themselves or being killed in order to attend their husbands in the underworld also show up in nearby Celtic cultures and in more distant but still Indo-European cultures from India. Unfortunately, we don't have another detailed account of Baldr's funeral, but in light of the evidence we have, it's hard not to wonder whether in an older version of the story, Nanna might actually have been ritually killed or might have even killed herself, as does the Valkyrie Brynhildr so that she can accompany the man she loves to the realm of the dead. And perhaps that little detail might have been lost in Prose narratives as it became distasteful. But let's accept Snorri's version for now. Thor, who is standing nearby, next performs some kind of consecration ritual over the funeral pyre with his hammer. But while he's doing it, a dwarf named Lit decides for whatever reason to get in the way and run in front of his feet. So Thor kicks him into the fire, and he gets burned as well. This is becoming the most efficient funeral of all time. The next thing Snorri tells us is that this event is widely attended by various kinds of beings. Apart from the gods and all their various animal companions, boars and cats and horses and whatnot, there's a great company of Hrimthursar, the so-called frost giants, and Bergrisar, the so-called mountain giants, in attendance as well. This seems to indicate once again that the Aesir and the Jotnar can meet on peaceful terms under various circumstances. In honor of his son, Odin places his famous golden arm ring Draupnir onto the funeral pyre, and Baldr's horse is given to the flames as well. We get one final detail about Baldr's funeral from the poem Vafthrudnismal. In this poem, Odin has traveled to the home of a Jotun named Vafthrudnir for the purpose of engaging in a battle of wits, which in this case really just means a test to see which of the two of them knows the most lore. They each take turns asking each other questions, and whoever doesn't know the answer to a question first is the loser. Odin has, of course, disguised himself on this occasion and is going by the name Gagnrādr, but the poem ends when Odin asks a question that reveals his identity to Vafthrudnir, very similar to what we saw in Baldr's Draumar. And it's also a question Vafthrudnir can't answer. The question is, what did Odin say into his son's ear before he mounted the pyre? Vafthrudnir's response is that no one knows what Odin whispered into Baldr's ear, but Larrington suggests one theory, that perhaps Odin may have whispered to him something that he has learned about the end of the world, that once Ragnarok has ended, Baldr will finally be able to return from the dead. But as I said, this is just a theory. Meanwhile, Hermodr is riding through dark valleys towards the High Hall of Hell, a journey which takes him 9 nights until he finally arrives at a river called Gjoll and sees that the bridge used to cross it is all covered with glowing gold. He rides up onto the bridge and finds that it's being guarded by a maiden named Moldgudr, a name that means something like furious battler. Moldgudr is confused why Hermodr is here, given that he doesn't have the color of a dead man, and he explains that he's been sent to speak to Hel about Baldr. He asks whether Moldgudr knows anything about Baldr, and she replies that Baldr has already ridden over this very bridge, and that, quote, downward and northward, on the other side, lies the road to Hel. It's an interesting point to keep in mind for anyone trying to piece together where exactly these locations lie on a map. So Hermodr continues on until he reaches Hel's gates, which are apparently closed. But this is no real problem because Hermodr is riding Sleipnir. He hops off the horse for a moment just to make sure all the harnesses and things are all tightened up.
Then he mounts Sleipnir again and spurs him forward. Sleipnir takes his cue and leaps high into the air, easily clearing the gates, and strides up to the hall where Hermodr dismounts, enters, and finds his brother Baldr sitting in the seat of honor in the hall, apparently being treated very well. We aren't given any information about this reunion or any conversation that takes place at this moment, but Hermodr decides to stay the night, and in the morning he explains to Hel that there is great weeping among the Aesir and begs her to let Baldr return home with him. Hel's response is that if it can be proven that Baldr really is as beloved by his people as Hermodr claims, she'll allow him to return to the Aesir. Quote, "If all things in the world, alive and dead, weep for him," she says, "then he'll be allowed to leave. But he will be kept with Hel if anyone or anything refuses to weep." Hermodr agrees to the terms and is escorted out of the hall by Baldr and also Nanna, who has succeeded in joining her husband in Hel. Baldr gives the ring Draupnir to Hermodr to carry back to Odin, and Nanna sends a linen robe and a few other gifts along to Frigg, as well as a finger ring for the goddess Fulla. One kinda neat point to call out here is that this ring ended up in Baldr's possession because it was placed into the funeral pyre alongside his body. And this type of idea is confirmed by the fact that we have lots of evidence from Norse graves indicating that the dead were indeed buried with things like sacrificed horses and other items intended for use in the afterlife. So Hermodr brings all these things back to Osgardr and explains the terms that Hel has laid out for Baldr's return. Upon hearing the news, the Aesir send out messengers to all the world to request that all people and animals and stones and trees and metal and the earth itself will all weep for Baldr. And, Snorri notes, you have seen them do it, every time they come out of the frost and into the heat. This is the origin of condensation, that all things on the earth continue to weep for Baldr. Now, as these messengers are traveling back home, having mostly fulfilled their mission, they come across a certain cave with a troll woman sitting inside. The troll woman introduces herself as Thok, which means thanks, and the messengers ask her if she will weep for Baldr alongside everyone and everything else, but she flatly refuses. Quote, "No good got I from the Old One's son, either dead or alive. Let Hel hold what she has," end quote. And it is presumed, Snorri now reveals in a not-so-unexpected twist, that this troll woman was actually Loki Laufeyarson in disguise, quote, "who has done most evil among the Aesir," end quote. Notice, of course, that Snorri is sort of non-committal about the phrasing here. It is only presumed that this troll woman was Loki in disguise. So why is everyone generally so sure that this is the correct answer? Well, there's an interesting exchange between Loki and Frigg in the poem Lokasenna that gets presented as follows, quote, "Frigg said, 'You know that if I had in here in Aegir's hall a boy like my son Baldr, you wouldn't get away from the Aesir's sons. There'd be furious fighting against you.' Loki said, 'Frigg, you want me to say more about my wicked deeds, for I brought it about that you will never again see Baldr ride to the halls.'" End quote. These stanzas seem to imply two things. One is that Baldr would have been expected to engage in furious fighting if he'd been present in the situation. He seems to be more than some kind of shining pacifist in the Norse mind. The second thing is that Loki is taking responsibility for the fact that Baldr will not be returning to the halls of the Aesir. If we combine this with Snorri's account, the one character who ultimately sealed Baldr's death in stone, removing all possibility of his return, at least for now, is Thok, the troll woman who refused to weep. As I mentioned, this version of Baldr's death comes to us in the form of a conversation between three wizards and a king in disguise. Upon hearing this twist ending, the king asks to know whether or not Loki was ever punished for any of these actions, and the answer is, indeed he was. But that punishment is a story in itself. So if you're curious to learn what happened to Loki as a result of his misdeeds, and if you're curious whatever happened to Hodr, who was tricked into taking the shot that killed Baldr, join me for part 2 of this story next time on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, 2007, The Road to Hel, a study of the conception of the dead in Old Norse literature by Hilda Ellis Davidson, published under the name Hilda Roderick Ellis, 1968. The Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.